Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary. For educational and discussion purposes only, always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. In this session, I want us to focus on a looming surge in layoffs, which is currently getting little media attention but is extremely important. As I will attempt to illustrate, this is because government statistics are somewhat misleading. They are misleading for two reasons. Layoffs are a lagging indicator, and the media focuses on current indicators, with some prognosticators actually talking leading indicators. Secondly, the U.S. government, like most governments around the world, are prone to politicizing and distorting economic statistics to their advantage. You may not agree with the latter, but it is a hard reality, as longtime Fed Governor Kevin Warsh recently came clean on during a Fox interview with Larry Kudlow. More on that later. I show here the agenda I will take us through to hopefully give you a perspective you're not getting in the mainstream or business media. I want to start by giving some required perspective on employment, unemployment, and layoffs. I'll try to make our discussions as much about the global view as the U.S. situation, the numbers on a global perspective being much harder to unearth. You will recognize this diagram from this year's thesis paper entitled A Great Stagflation. I've been quite clear that though I believe the main economic developments outlined here will unfold over this decade, when and the degree of amplitude of each will not be nearly as orderly and symmetrical as this illustration suggests. One of the key milestones I felt needed to be specifically labeled in this schematic, based on our research, was the importance of the impact of potential surging unemployment. The World Economic Forum highlighted the cost of living as the number one out of 32 major issues that world economic, political, and corporate leaders expressed in their survey leading up to this year's Davos Global Summit in January. Even in this year's 2023 macro themes, almost all our themes had an element of jobs, earnings, and employment in them. U.S. real disposable income fell over $1 trillion in 2022, the second largest percentage drop in real disposable income ever. Only 1932, the worst year of the Great Depression, being worse since the economic data began being tracked. This should come as no surprise to our longtime readers of our research. In this chart from 2011, see the copyright in the bottom right corner, we already had a roadmap of where we were going as we came out of the 2000 financial crisis and launched round one of quantitative easing. We felt we had placed ourselves on a predetermined path of monetary malpractice that by 2012 was clear would inevitably lead to dysfunctional financial markets marked by malinvestment and delusion. Seems very appropriate of what we experience on a daily basis today. Our 2013 thesis paper was written to bring this roadmap into clear view. It is available on the Matasi.com website or by clicking Update Profile at the bottom of your weekly newsletter mailer. The reason I highlight statism is because what statism really means and encompasses. It means big government, centralized control, higher taxes, fees, licenses, restrictive regulation, and shrinking opportunities. It means getting less for more in disposable income versus more for less in a fully operational capitalist system. It means higher interest rates, macroprudential policies of financial repression, quantitative easing for the state, and capital controls as needed to get money where it is needed by the state. We are clearly there in many of these areas now, as even this recent concerning chart from the IMF highlighted. The 40-year era of what has come to be called the Great Moderation has come to an end. Globalization delivered lower costs for consumer goods through cheap labor. Globalization has slowed and in some areas is beginning to reverse, as supply chains are reassessed and onshoring begins to occur in the areas of strategic materials and goods. Financialization delivered cheap finance rates for asset appreciation. It is also reversed as interest rates has surged through critical long-term overhead resistance levels. Mercantilism employed by first Japan and then China has reversed what has delivered an overpriced U.S. dollar and a corresponding unprecedented U.S. consumption level of 70% of the economy. The shift in all three of these was a direct fallout of the COVID-19 shock. As these shifts unfold with sustained levels of elevated inflation, we can expect risks to be repriced. We've already begun to witness this with asset prices, but it will get worse as duration risk premia in bonds increases as well as equity risk premiums. This will lead to margin pressure and pressures on operating costs. Many over-leveraged and zombie corporations will feel the pain and layoffs will begin. We aren't there yet, but our work in this year's thesis paper suggests it is soon to unfold. We came at it from a strictly analytic perspective after overlaying untold economic indicators going all the way back to World War I. The synthesis delivered this chart of the U.S. unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is highly likely to increase to a shocking 10 to 12% over the next 12 to 24 months. This is going to be very unexpected to markets and to your investment portfolio if you're not fully prepared. One of the precursors of such a rise in unemployment is a broad-based collapse in consumer confidence. This is evident if you look at consumer confidence on a worldwide basis. Personally, I've never seen anything quite like this before. Like I showed earlier, the U.S. has not witnessed a collapse in real disposable income like we experienced in 2022 since the depths of the Great Depression in 1932. This is all some pretty seriously negative and frightening news. But all the happy talk coming out of Washington is in stark contrast. Former Fed Chairman and now U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is pretty clear about how good things are. I was shocked at the lack of insight this recent statement made by her showed in her thinking. On the surface, this makes academic sense. So let's look at the employment reporting being put out by the U.S. government's Bureau of Labor Statistics. The latest release was an absolute shocker, as many of you are well aware. At 8 sigma, it was off the charts versus expectations. Apparently, we created 517,000 new jobs. This fractured every labor trend line out there and most critically reversed the expectations for the Fed to soon start cutting rates and thereby buying the Fed more critical time to fight inflation. As a consequence, the corresponding unemployment Janet Yellen trumpeted fell to her 53-year low. This shocker begged a lot of obvious questions. What was quickly evident for anyone bothering to take the time to actually study the numbers was that 3 major adjustments were made to the statistics and methodology. 1, seasonal adjustments were changed for 2023. As usual, no details were actually given on what went into those mysterious changes. Second, the household survey used new U.S. Census data for the very first time. 3, adjustments were made to the population estimates for the household survey sampling. This notice, which was the only thing that accompanied the release, stated the population estimates reflected changes to net international migration, updated vital statistics, and improvements in estimation methodologies. It is any guess what international migration is actually referring to, other than possibly illegal migrants crossing the southern border, or what vital statistics needed actually updating, or what estimation methodology needed improvements. A lot of gobbledygook that tells you nothing on what they did behind the curtain. The report also uses a new terminology called the population control effect. Basically, they used the household survey, which argued that 894,000 jobs were added in a single month, which defies anything ever seen. Uncomfortable with that, as you would expect they would be submitting this to the public, they actually state that 810,000 of these jobs were added by this population control effect, and felt obligated to tell us that the net after this adjustment was actually 84,000 jobs, which got almost no press coverage. For some reason, they felt even necessary to put this in a chart format. It appears someone was concerned that the Inspector General may have also been as skeptical as many of us were. Its seasonal adjustments added over 2 million people to the non-farm payrolls numbers for the economy in both January 2022 and January 2023. Without these adjustments, only 152 million people are working, as opposed to the 155 million the official numbers claimed. Similarly, the household survey was adjusted to add over 1 million people to the employed category. So in December of 2022, these 1 million people were not counted as employed. In January 2023, they were. Not because they obtained jobs, because the BLS model tweaked the number higher. Part-time employment supposedly jumped by 627,000 in January 2023, despite the clear historical trend that part-time employees should drop after the holidays. There's always holes you'll find immediately when people start playing around with numbers and statistics. They were pretty evident in this report. The BLS also claims that only 5,000 tech workers lost their jobs in January. The real number of tech workers who lost their jobs is minimally 85,000, which we'll talk more about that number in a moment. In case you think I'm being somewhat of a conspiracy nut job, you need to listen to this recent interview of longtime Fed Governor Kevin Warsh. He specifically felt compelled to state that, and I quote, no major corporations, like the Federal Reserve, as he's referring to, would use data from the BLS, that is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the Commerce Department, end of quote. He mentions the Commerce Department because it was responsible for the census report that was used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I might add that it may be interesting to point out the Labor Secretary Marty Walsh unexpectedly and abruptly resigned less than 2 weeks after the labor numbers were released, who would have had to sign off on any changes made by the BLS or possible directions coming directly from the White House. Walsh was the former mayor of Boston, and it was a shock when he was plucked for Biden's cabinet, along with Governor Gina Raimondo from Rhode Island for Secretary of Commerce. These are two politicians with no exposure to the national stage, well known here and frankly both well respected. It is interesting that the Department of Commerce Census Survey was a key part of the changes to the BLS's issued labor report. Just thought some of you might be interested. As they say in Washington, there may be conspiracies, but there are no coincidences. I want to come back to the 85,000 tech job layoff numbers I mentioned a moment ago. We have been rigorously using a developing database addressing global layoffs. In 2022, this database tracked 1,045 tech companies with layoffs of just under 161,000. In 2023, this database lists 385 tech companies with layoffs of nearly 109,000 employees. During this period of just over 1 year, our current readout shows we are now tracking 1,457 tech companies that total 251,392 layoffs. This global database has expanded to more than just tech companies. It is now showing us 2,276 companies with already 367,000 layoffs. I'm not sure what ZeroHedge.com is using for their source, but I found it interesting that they cited with their January labor release reporting, and I quote their similar skepticism, that it was, end quote, at a time when mass layoff news was hitting them every 45 minutes, end of quote. Yeah, that kind of matches our expectations of how this spreadsheet's changing. I believe it is important to focus not on the actual number of layoffs, but rather the layoffs as a total of companies' total employee base. In November, because we believe this, we first started detailing the numbers by showing percentages versus actual numbers. 15 to 25% cuts are threatening to a company's viability and sustainability. The best way to illustrate why is to look at this comparison in the banking sector of total employment going into the 2008 financial crisis versus what we are about to experience today. Banking populations, like all major corporations, have been dramatically pared back over the last decade as layers of middle management were taken out with advancements of reporting technologies and methodologies. Generally, corporations have been cut to the bone. Layoffs today are taking out the bone. This means impairment to their ability to actually deliver product quality, deliveries, service, and support. I'm sure this is evident to anyone who has had to phone a company to only wait endlessly for someone to actually answer, or find someone who could answer or resolve what it seemed to be a very simple question. I saw a sign a while ago, openly displayed in an office that I was visiting, that said it succinctly but somewhat sarcastically, and I quote, "We are being asked to do more and more with less and less. Soon we will be asked to do everything with nothing." End of quote. The fact that they were proudly displaying this I found quite surprising in itself. As a telling example of what is underway, Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon gathered his top executives in a closed-door meeting last week in Miami. The details of the meeting were leaked to the London Financial Times. Apparently, Solomon acknowledged his plan to lay off thousands of employees should have been enacted sooner. I quote, according to one person with direct knowledge of what Solomon actually said at the closed meeting event, as the environment was growing more complicated in Q2 of last year, every bone in my body believed we should be much more aggressive in slowing hiring and reducing headcount. End of quote. Solomon said Goldman fired 3,200 employees, or about 6.5% of its headcount, last month. You need to be aware that Solomon went on a hiring spree in recent years. Since the end of 2018, the headcount at the investment bank has jumped 34% to more than 49,000. Now the firing cycle is underway. Many companies were similar in pushing to find employees, were grabbing them, paying up because there was such a shortage. So when they found them, they hired them. Solomon acknowledged at the event that if he was to have reduced headcount earlier, such as in early 2022, that the number of employees fired would have been less drastic. Goldman's net profits last year plunged nearly 50% from record earnings in 2021. We are clearly seeing layoffs beginning everywhere, from auto companies like Ford to investment banks like Goldman to technology companies, especially those who once had disruptive in their name. Tech giant Meta looks to be setting up to continue this trend. That's because despite Meta already laying off 11,000 employees, it has now ranked thousands of new employees subpar on their most recent performance reviews. This is obviously setting up these employees for another wave of layoffs. CEO and founder Mark Zuckerberg has already said that 2023 would be, quote, a year of efficiency, end of quote, for the company, signaling to Wall Street that such cuts would likely be forthcoming. According to Fortune, managers at the company have given about 10% of its workers poor reviews, returning to a standard the company used to use prior to the pandemic before Zuckerberg allowed leniency in performance reviews. The news comes only days after the company said it would be delaying finalizing its budgets, with Zuckerberg writing in Facebook post this month, quote, "We're working on flattening the organizational structure and removing some layers of middle management to make decisions faster, as well as deploying AI tools to help our engineers be more productive. As part of this, we're going to be more productive about cutting projects that aren't performing or may no longer be as crucial." End of quote. Again, I quote Zuckerman. "We closed last year with some difficult layoff and restructuring some teams. When we did this, I said clearly that this was the beginning of our focus on efficiency and not the end." You can't make it much clearer. When Wayne Gretzky was asked why he was as great a hockey player as he was, he responded, "I go where the puck is going to be, not where it is." It is the same with investing. You need to know the difference between leading indicators, concurrent indicators, and lagging indicators. When it comes to credit and rates, the 2-year Treasury notes historically always leads the Fed, or as most know, the Fed actually follows the 2-year note. Bank tightening then follows, where we are now, with loan delinquencies following, which has already begun, with layoffs then mounting, and then loan defaults occurring. From a different perspective, you might want to assess hope. Where slowing housing leads, then new orders from ISM falls, then corporate profits begin collapsing, with unemployment abruptly spiking. Keep these sequences in front of you as you watch for the layoffs to really accelerate. More and more, the layoffs are not of blue-collar workers, but white-collar workers. Though all are professionals, the white-collar, non-union workers have historically been given richer severance packages. It is taking longer for these layoffs to show up in the labor number statistics since they often collect pay for many months after. The longer employment tenure is, the longer the package and payout period. As companies cut to the bone, the delay can only be expected to be longer and dampen, therefore, some of the effects on the official reporting, but nevertheless, they're laid off employees. Janet Yellen is obviously oblivious to such basic realities. She also appears to not appreciate that the unemployed 99s from COVID-19 are only now coming off their unemployment insurance and therefore are no longer counted as unemployed. They become members of the nearly 100 million showing up in the plummeting labor force participation rate, the black hole, if you would. What can we conclude? Layoffs are coming, as well as the ability to find a living wage job, especially as inflation mounts and real disposable income only continues to fall. Remember, though inflation rates are still coming down, the prices aren't. Corporations faced with an inflation-driven wage price spiral, slowing sales, and margin pressures need a more encompassing answer than just layoffs today. Employee levels are already thin, as I've said, and this is why I've been stressing that today it is more about the percentage of the total population corporations are laying off. But that is still not the answer, as they have long ago taken out the fat, as I said, in their relentless job cuts and are now cutting into the bone. The concurrent problem CEOs are facing is that productivity is also plummeting. They're increasingly desperate to endorse almost any solution that will deliver cost reductions and improved productivity. The problem with falling productivity is global. It means the move to advancing robotics, increasingly married to artificial intelligence, is on its way, and more rapidly than many yet expect. The tens of millions of professional truck and car drivers, the biggest single employment sector in America, is soon going to see a relentless attack, as are many professional white-collar sectors that have previously been protected from mass layoffs: programmers, writers, editors, illustrators, and the list goes on as the use of artificial intelligence attacks the information and knowledge worker. It is coming, so pay attention with hope. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take that money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policy of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis or lack of coordination. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They're for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and often not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2023 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I sincerely thank you for listening.